I'm Anita Huberman. I'm President and CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade. We are Surrey's city building business organization. I'm also an honorary captain of the Royal Canadian Navy, appointed by the Defense Minister of Canada. Thank you so much for attending today digitally on a very important topic for our economy. And that is about bringing staff back to the office. It is Workplace 2.0, and we want to know and understand your questions, your issues, your comments related to the next phase of this pandemic. But we're on a good trajectory to ensure that we're focused on economic recovery. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today. Please type your questions in the chat function of the technology as you hear their presentations. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of our Coast Salish people, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Coquitlam, Kaiket, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen First Nations. We also live, learn, work, and play on the land of the Inuit and Métis peoples. Thank you so much for your partnership to our First Nation communities. I'd also like to acknowledge that we recognize that we're in a global conflict right now that is really affecting our global economy. And we stand with the people of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone, events like this don't happen without sponsorship support. Thank you so much to our Progress partners, the law firm of Fasken, Scotiabank, BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, the Chambers of Commerce Group Insurance Plan, represented by SNF Benefits and Western Community College. Thank you so much for your support of Surrey's city building business organization. The Surrey Board of Trade is one of the top 10 largest chambers of commerce boards of trades in the country. There are 450 of us. Our role is to support business, bring business into Surrey through a very diversified service portfolio of workforce development, business development, trade development, cost-saving, time-saving benefits, instigating change at the different levels of government, and with our events, making sure that we are the concierge of connections. If you need anything, please contact the Surrey Board of Trade or contact me, Anita, at businessinsurrey.com. We're there for you. Surrey is going to be the largest city in British Columbia very soon. Our ecosystem of business support, no matter what we're facing in our socioeconomic circumstances, we are there for you. We've been in Surrey since 1918, supporting businesses in Surrey and in the greater business community, regionally, provincially, and nationally. Everyone, BC took a very big step forward recently as they announced that it is time to start transitioning back to the workforce. The provincial health officer, Bonnie Henry, who we meet with every so often, is really focused on ensuring that she is engaging with the business community and really focused on supporting the transition of employees back into the workplace. And that's why we're hosting this session today, so that you as businesses, you as organizations, as leaders, and even your workforce are prepared for this next phase of the pandemic. And as I mentioned, it is Workplace 2.0. The BC government recognizes that the workplace is different. For some, it's been nearly 2 full years of working remotely. Many workplaces will be able to transition to in-person work again quickly. Others may wish to continue with remote or hybrid work models. But really, how do you, as an owner, as a manager, as a leader, handle that conversation about bringing staff back to the workplace? What safety measures and policies should you have in place? And how can you make the transition easy and smooth for your staff, ensuring Still, bottom line profitability, because that is why you are in business. So first, I want to introduce a panel of experts from WorkSafeBC, Human Resources, and the legal industry. Our first speaker, everyone, is the Director for Occupational Health and Safety, Consultation and Education Services from WorkSafeBC, who we have been working very closely with in the past, especially in the past more than 2 years. Please help me welcome Chris back. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anita, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here again. I had the opportunity to speak with you folks a few times over the last 2 years, and it's absolutely our pleasure to be able to pass along information and help employers and workers as best as possible as we go through the challenges of the pandemic. I'm going to just share my screen here, so bear with me for 1 second. Got about 10 minutes that I'm just going to run through a few slides. Hopefully you can see that. If you can't, let me know. So we're going to just get into a little bit around reactivating the COVID safety plans, and also include a little bit on some information resources that are available to you. It's kind of old hat to a lot of employers. There's not a lot of change that has occurred over the 2 phases of the COVID safety plans, but I did want to speak about a few nuances and just provide some reminders to employers around what needs to be included within the COVID-19 safety plan that you need to have in place. So let's just talk about reactivating those plans. Going back to the announcement on January 7th from the provincial health officer, that we were shifting back to COVID-19 safety plans. So you might recall in July of last year when the province moved to, at that point, step 3 of the reopening, we went from COVID-19 safety plans to communicable disease prevention plans. And so up until January, for about that 6-month period, there was a requirement for a communicable disease prevention plan. And that would be an ongoing requirement into the future, even once COVID is complete. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a few moments. But what Dr. Henry indicated on January 7th was to sort of up the game again and go back to that more robust COVID-19 safety plan, which speaks to a few other measures that need to be in place. So we do have a link at the bottom of this, and these slides can be shared afterwards. Have a link at the bottom here directly to the workplace safety order on the PHO website. And even though we've seen some restrictions lift over the last little while, and likely some more restrictions to lift, in March and in April, at this point in time, the workplace safety order is still in place, and there is a requirement for employers to have that COVID safety plan activated. So what does this mean, transitioning to a COVID-19 safety plan? Well, communicable disease prevention essentially covered the fundamental principles of preventing transmission and disease. And there's really 5 ongoing measures, and I'll speak to those on the next slide. There's 5 ongoing measures that you need to consider as an employer relative to the communicable disease prevention plan. Then what we also talked about during CDP, communicable disease prevention, was that there might be a requirement for additional measures at certain times, depending on the escalation of the situation. And that could be at a local level, right at the employer level. It could be at a regional level. It could be at a provincial level. So right now we are in that state at a provincial level, where there is that requirement for more robust measures to be put in place. One of the big differences between communicable disease prevention and COVID-19 safety plans is that the COVID-19 safety plans are formal written plans that do need to be documented, and they do need to be posted for all people coming into the work site. That would include your workers, any contractors or service providers, as well as the general public. Communicable disease prevention plans do not need to be documented, and they're a little less formal. So just to give you an idea of sort of the rigor associated with COVID-19 safety plans. So what does this mean for employers? Well, for many employers, and you might recall back in the summer of last year that Dr. Henry indicated that employers should consider keeping their COVID-19 safety plan protocols in place in areas where it doesn't impact their business continuity or business operations. So for many employers, this might not be a lot of change. But what you need to be doing at this point in time is developing and updating your COVID safety plan based on what's outlined in the order, and just reviewing your plan to ensure that it does currently align with guidance, not only within the workplace health order, but also in any other orders that may apply to your industry. So what we've done is we've sort of broken down that workplace safety order into a little bit more detail. And you'll see here that that we've got a number of bullets outlined, and I'll kind of walk through this. There's 5 bullets in the middle there that are italicized, and those ones are directly in line with the Communicable Disease Prevention Plan to give you an idea of what will be required from a WorkSafeBC perspective, even after COVID-19 safety plan order is lifted. So really what the COVID-19 safety plan outlines is that employers need to ensure that they're preventing any crowding in public and indoor spaces. And this might mean, pinch points, so entryways, exit ways, possibly break rooms if you're in an office setting. So break room like a lunchroom, hallways maybe, depending on what's happening. But the employer needs to have protocols in place to prevent that crowding of people in indoor spaces. The employer also needs to ensure that face coverings are being worn in indoor common areas. And again, those common areas might be elevators, break rooms, hallways. And again, if we're considering the office environment, if your workers are in their offices or in their workstations, they don't need to be wearing a face covering at that point. But essentially, when they leave their office and go into more of the common areas, they do need to be wearing face coverings. And then the next 5 have been ongoing throughout the entire pandemic and were included within communicable disease prevention. So having policies to support staff with symptoms, meaning that if your staff have symptoms, they should not be coming into the workplace. They should be sent home. Ensuring that you have policies and you've communicated those policies to workers. And one of the key points associated with this one is ensuring that your workers are following the guidance from BC CDC around self-isolation. And that has changed over the last number of months and it's been shifted. So it's really important that you as the employer are familiar with what's required and that you're communicating that to your workers so that they are also familiar with what's required around that self-isolation and self-monitoring protocols. The second one there in the italicized piece is around providing facilities for and promoting hand hygiene. Now, this was already a requirement prior to the pandemic. It falls under section 4.85 of the regulation, which ensures that plumbed and portable washroom facilities are readily available, are maintained, and are kept clean, as well as having the right supplies and materials available for your staff. And then this goes just a little bit further to say that employers need to also be promoting to their staff the importance of hand hygiene. Maintaining a clean environment, and that's going to be up to you and up to the type of environment that you work in, but that is a requirement as well. Ensuring building ventilation is adequately and properly maintained. Again, this was already a requirement under sections 4.70 through 4.80 of the regulation around indoor air quality. And it essentially means that you need to ensure that it's being maintained, it's being inspected, and it's operating as per manufacturer's instructions. And then the last 2 there, the first one is around supporting employees in receiving vaccinations. So it doesn't mean you have to have a policy in place that your staff have to be vaccinated, but you do need to be supporting vaccination. So encouraging staff to be vaccinated and also giving them the space and the time off to become vaccinated along the way. Now, the last one I put in orange there because at the beginning of the order coming out on January 7th, the allow was actually a must, that employers must allow their workers to work from home where possible. That has been dropped now from this order as of the announcement that came out in February. So it's no longer a requirement to have your workers work from home where possible, but it is still an option that's available to you. The 6 steps, I'm not going to go through these in detail because I think everyone's fairly familiar with it, but just to say that employers, should follow these 6 steps in developing their plan. So assessing the risks, implementing protocols based on the hierarchy of controls, developing policies to manage the workplace, ensuring that the policies and the plan is communicated to your staff and any training is provided, particularly where any new protocols are being put in place, monitoring, so that plan, do, check, act approach, and then also assessing and addressing any risks from resuming operations, such as your place of business not being open for a few years. What do you need to do to ensure that other risks are being considered in reopening? Involving your workers is key throughout this process. There's already requirements around joint occupational health and safety committees or worker health and safety representatives, depending on how large you are. There is requirements in the Act around the rights of workers, which include being aware of and involved in health and safety. But now more than ever, this is important for employers to be considering. Involve your workers, involve your joint committees in this conversation around your COVID safety plan and updating your plan. And it can really go a long ways to allaying the fear that people may still have coming back into the workplace, particularly if they've been working at home for a long period of time and are now going to start coming back into that more public setting. There's also responsibilities for workers. Workers need to participate in the review of the COVID-19 safety plan. They need to be self-monitoring for symptoms and following the BC CDC guidance, complying with any employer's instructions around minimizing exposure. There's also a requirement specifically within the order that workers are responsible for wearing a face covering in indoor common areas. There are exemption criteria. I'm not going to go through those. They are outlined in the order. But if you do not fall into one of those exemption criteria, you need to be wearing wearing a mask, and that is outlined within the order for workers and specific to workers. And then also reporting hazards and refusing unsafe work, and that is a responsibility of the workers. And there are responsibilities of the employer to then follow up if any of those issues do come forward, which is also very clearly outlined in the Act and the regulation. So just wrapping up with a couple, two last slides here. One is just to say there's a number of resources available on our website. We have a COVID-19 safety plan template, which has been updated and available for employers to use. We've reinstituted the web pages on industry-specific protocols if you want to take a look at any of those. And we've got lots of posters, information sheets, and links to public health guidance that's available for you. If you can't find what you're looking for or you have questions, please don't hesitate to give us a call. We've got our two mainline numbers here, one for the Lower Mainland, one for outside of the Lower Mainland. We're answering that phone within 30 seconds and referring to prevention officers to provide full response and action requests as necessary. And anyone can call this line, the public, workers, employers, anyone. And we are here to help and consult throughout the pandemic and really with actually any other health and safety issue that you may have. So that's it for me, Anita. I will hand it back over to you and look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much, Chris. And everyone, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat function of the technology. Our next speaker, providing the legal perspective, is from the law firm of Fasken, Mr. David McDonald. David, over to you.
Thank you, Anita, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Anita mentioned, this is a very timely topic, a very important topic for organizations and employers in Surrey and throughout British Columbia and the rest of the world, as we are watching hopefully a permanent rollback of what we've been through in the past 2+ years with dealing with COVID in the workplaces. And I'm very happy to follow Chris's presentation, which was an excellent presentation. I don't have slides, but what I'm going to do is speak to 5 issues that our labor and employment lawyers are dealing with, questions from employers, what to do and what we see as trends coming down for employers as workplaces open back up. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is for those employers that chose to implement mandatory vaccination requirements. Not every workplace has done this, but a significant number of workplaces have required employees to be vaccinated. And for the small percentage of employees that are not vaccinated, that's led to consequences such as layoffs, unpaid leaves of absence, and in some cases, termination of employment. In Chris's comments, he indicated that an employer's obligation in the current state of WorkSafe requirements are to support vaccination. There's never been a direction from the provincial government for private organizations to have a mandatory vaccination policy outside of the healthcare industry. So some employers have chosen to go beyond and have introduced mandatory vaccination policies. And the question that I think is coming up now for employers is, well, when do we lift that requirement? And what do we do with employees who are on leave? And that's an interesting question, and there's no definitive answer to that, but it's something that organizations that do have mandatory vaccination requirements, it was never designed to be a permanent requirement in the workplace. Now, there have been legal challenges, primarily in unionized workplaces, to employer policies requiring vaccinations. And on the whole, employer policies requiring vaccinations have been upheld. There are instances from primarily from the province of Ontario where employer policies regarding vaccinations have been required to be modified to include a testing option for workplaces for employees who do not who choose not to be vaccinated. So the employer in those circumstances was required to implement a testing component to their policy, along with a mandatory vaccination component to the policy. So on the whole, the employer policies have been upheld, but the question now is, given the change in prevalence of COVID, given the fact that we appear to be seeing a wave receding, at what point is it appropriate for an employer to lift that policy? And my advice to clients has generally been follow the lead of the provincial health officer, speak to the regional health authorities. So the Fraser Health District has been very responsive for our clients in the Surrey area to deal with questions about implementation of these policies in the workplace. So the timing of changing your policies is going to be important. They're not permanent policies. Building on the second thing I'd like to talk about is whether a work from home situation is going to be sustainable. And of course, the answer for that is going to depend on the organization. As Anita mentioned in her opening comments, not every workplace has had the same response to employees working from home. And as Chris mentioned, the current state of requirement is that employers should allow work from home practices or a continuation of work from home currently if it's possible. So this isn't, this comment is not for every workplace, but what I think you're going to see as you invite employees to return to work is there is going to be a significant portion of employees who are resistant to return to work. And one of the things that we're seeing is that, in the last 2 years, a number of employees have actually potentially moved away from where their workplace was. So they're not actually able to commute. A lot of people have taken advantage of the pandemic to move away to the interior, to other provinces, and they've continued to provide their services. And employers are calling us as employment counsel saying, what should we do with so-and-so who's moved to Nelson? Our office is in Surrey. We require people to be in the office, and now he or she's working from Nelson. They're doing their job fine, but it's just not something we want to have as sustainable. And that's really an issue that you have to discuss with your employees, and you need to determine if it's sustainable or not. And one thing that employers need to be aware of is there can be there can be jurisdictional issues, particularly when employees move and are working in other provinces, including coverage from WorkSafe, including coverage in your benefit plans. There's also a legal issue about which employment standards regime covers that employee. So the work from home and the permanence of work from home relationships, even when the pandemic is hopefully over permanently, will continue to be a discussion for employers. The third point is a really important one, and we're seeing this a lot in our employment law practice, in our human rights practice. It's the increasing prevalence of mental health concerns for employees. This pandemic has not been easy on anyone. It's been a frenetic 2 years. Lots of change has happened. lots of situations that have caused strain for the mental health of employees and managers. And I think most organizations should take this time, as we're coming back to a change in the workplace, to look at what supports it has to deal with employees who have mental health issues, whether it's an employee assistance program that's available for employees. What are your provisions on leaves of absence for mental health issues? We do now have, since January 1st, we have 5 paid sick days for provincially regulated employers. Federally regulated employers also have a form of paid sick leave. So that leads to employees thinking about taking time off work to deal with mental health issues. The numbers of and the increase in mental health concerns are significant. As recently as December, there were surveys of employees, and up to 44% of respondents indicated that they felt their mental health was not in a strong place, and that's dealing with workplace issues. So these are significant percentages of people, and the good employers will be thinking about what kind of support, what kind of resources do we have to give to employees. Of course, there is a need for employees to be healthy and productive and attending work, and balancing that with a healthy mental health support system for employees is a difficult thing for employers, but it's something that we will be dealing with in the coming years and months. The fourth issue that I want to touch on as what I think is important as the return to work, and you might have seen news reports about this. In the US, they're calling it the Great Resignation, which is that the number of individuals who are taking stock of whether they're going to return to work is significant. And this is different than the working from home issue. It's the fact that employees are deciding, for whatever reason, whether it's they've enjoyed assistance while during the pandemic from the government, or they've just been away from work and they don't want to do what they've been doing. Whatever the reason is, certainly in the US, the numbers are significant of employees who are not returning to workplaces. In Canada, based on the information I've heard, the situation is not as dramatic as the United States, but certainly any employer in Surrey and British Columbia generally can tell you there is a shortage of qualified people coming to work. Right now, it is a job seekers market. They will have an opportunity for any number of job opportunities. As an employer lawyer, as an employment lawyer who represents management, this is useful in dealing with wrongful dismissal cases, because you can turn to the plaintiff's lawyer and say, well, your client may be unemployed, but he has lots of opportunities to go and find alternate work. He should find work, and that cuts down on damages. But from an employer's perspective, the need for qualified individuals to fill vacancies is acute right now. And what that's doing in some situations is it's driving up salaries, it's driving up offers of employment, and in collective bargaining for unionized employers, we're starting to see significant demands from unions on the monetary front in order to remain competitive. So that issue of employee shortage is certainly with us now, and is going to remain with us, in my estimation, for the next couple of years at least. And the final issue I'd like to talk about is just to put on the radar of the employers in this seminar is what's called the right to disconnect. And we've seen this in other jurisdictions, primarily in Europe, where there are statutory requirements for employers to not contact employees after business hours. And that concept, which is very strong in countries like France, where there's legislation on fixing hours of work and turning off cell phones and and disabling notifications to employees, and employers actually being penalized by the government for breaching the hours of work requirement by sending emails after hours, that statutory concept will begin to migrate over the Atlantic, and we're already starting to see it in jurisdictions like Ontario. So the issue of employees having time away from work, getting away from their cell phones, getting away from their laptops is something that I think our current provincial government will be looking at in the next little bit. So pay attention for that to come down the pipe. So that's just 5 issues that I thought I'd share with you. Any of our labor and employment lawyers at Fasken, whether it's in Vancouver or at our Surrey office, would be happy to talk to you about any of these issues, or any specific questions you have as your employees come back to work. So Anita, those are my comments, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, David. And from the human resources perspective, please help me welcome Armin Layegh. Armin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anita, and Surrey Board of Trade for the invitation, and fantastic presentation, Chris and David. I certainly am walking away with learning quite a bit. Hopefully the small presentation that I have for you won't be too redundant, because David and Chris both covered significant amount of information there. But with your permission, I'm just going to put myself, stop the video and bring the presentation up so I can share the screen. Just bear with me for a moment. And hopefully everybody can see my screen here. So as Anita mentioned, my name is Armin, and I've been in human resources and talent acquisition field for 20 years, over 20 years now, actually. And we currently are working with a number of clients, both locally and globally, that are essentially dealing with the same issues that you as employers or business owners are dealing with, and that is the return to work. With Anita's permission, I changed the title to today's session on my screen to "What You Need to Know About Bringing Staff Back to the Office." I did this because not to assume that folks are not working just because they're not attending an office. So instead of "back to work," I changed that to "back to the office." The low employment rate that David touched on is significant, and I am going to be talking about that very specific topic momentarily. But before I do that, I do want to bring some headlines to your attention. These are just over the past 72-hour headlines that I managed to grab for this presentation. And as you can see, CIBC, Twitter, Walmart, Google, they're all asking their employees to go back to work. But that is not to say that they're not having challenges with having people return to the office. Essentially, what we are experiencing locally is shared globally. Now, going to the next slide, as Anita mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, at issues are 3 topics: remote work and in-office or hybrid. So those are the options. How to handle the conversation about bringing staff back to the workplace. And finally, what safety measures and policies are required. The last topic, I think Chris and David covered it really well, so I won't be sharing any information on that topic or talking about it at this point, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. But what I do want to talk about is the concept of return to work. And the question that I want to pose is, does it have to be a this or that option? And can it be hybrid? So what do I mean by that? In this slide, you're going to see a number of steps that can be taken to assist you as owners or business partners to really manage what is a change management process. If you look back at the early stages of the pandemic, we expected people to adopt new technologies and adapt to the circumstances that COVID-19 was presenting. Well, we are expecting the same, just in reverse. Now we are telling people that they need to be back in the office, and we want them to be carrying on as though everything was the way it was. Well, unfortunately, I don't think, having worked with clients, that is going to work. So what can work? And these are the steps that I want to share with you. The first and foremost is I encourage businesses to conduct an internal needs assessment. So what does that mean? Essentially, before asking employees return, conduct a needs assessment with a few questions to ask before asking employees that they are telling employees that they have to be back in the office. Questions can be something as simple as, does the position require the employees to be in the office? So ask yourself that and the employee, and then turn that around and ask the employee, do you want or need to be in the office? Is hybrid model a possibility? And finally, does the technology allow for remote work? If you have answers to these for yourself and the employees, then I would encourage to go out with a bigger survey and then communicate the results with the employees. So really allow the employees to have a say in whether or not they are needed in the office. Can they be there, or are they willing to be there? Throughout the process, I encourage everyone to please show real empathy. Empathize with employees, but psychological, such as social and environmental factors, mental, emotional, and physical limitations and or challenges that they may be facing. A term that I've been throwing around over the past couple of years, which applies to me personally as well, is the mental exhaustion. I think we all feeling that now. And how can we overcome those? I personally don't think, based on my assessment of the clients that we're working with, telling people to return to the office no matter what, it will only add to the mental exhaustions that employees are facing. And also find out who owns the business, the position, and who should be held accountable for the work that is done or not done. So give employees a sense of ownership, because most of them, at least currently, enjoy a real or at least perceived sense of ownership and control over their lives. We all have employment responsibilities and at-home obligations. Once we take that away from employees, then what are they left with? And how can we answer that question? Give them a sense, if you are really keen on bringing employees back, give them a sense of belonging. Create a sense of importance for employees to be back in the office. Create a sense of belonging through an attachment to the office. And finally, motivate them. Motivate employees by reminding them how great it was to be back in the office. Maybe it's the barbecues, maybe it's the social gatherings, the camaraderie, and also just the projects that they worked on together. Show them how their presence in the office benefits both parties, employers and employees. On the last slide, I wanted to bring a couple of points to your attention, including one that David touched on, which I think it was important. Consider the outcome of a hasty and or forceful return to the office decision. Companies should prepare for backlash if that's part of the mandated process. Remember, by returning to the office, it doesn't necessarily mean a higher productivity. It could, in fact, result in a lower productivity. And don't forget resignations. David said that it is a real issue for our US-based clients, but it is here too. In 2021, 30% of workers were looking to quit if they were going to be asked to return to the office. I can tell you that that number has increased to 40%. And as an HR professional, we are dealing with it on a daily basis. So don't be surprised if folks decide to resign from their employment, because they have options available to them. It is a very tight talent market right now. And finally, make it clear to your employees that they're valued and they belong where they are, and that you will make it easy for them to return to the office. And if you look at the picture on the right-hand side from Chris Pratt, that's an example of reminding people what it was like to be back in the office. On that, I am going to stop sharing and come back online. Thank you so much, Anita, Chris, David, and the team.
Thank you so much, Armin, and David and Chris, if you could turn your cameras on as we go into the question period. And absolutely, I've been back in the office actually since April 2020, because that's where I was most productive. But everyone is different in terms of how they work. And really, as leaders, we need to understand and be able to ensure bottom line productivity in the workplace through various mechanisms in this new socioeconomic circumstances that we live in. Well, I do have a question from an audience member. I think it was David, you articulated that the BC government possibly putting in legislation about doing work while you're on vacation, or not doing work while you're on vacation, or after hours, what the accountabilities are as an employer. One of the questions is, would that include board of directors reaching out to staff after hours? So what are the expectations, knowing the board is the employer of the president and CEO, for example?
Right. Well, I want to be clear that there is no right to disconnect legislation in British Columbia. So what I was talking about is this could be coming down the road, right? So it's a little bit of a Nostradamus thing I was trying to do, is to predict what's coming. But we can look at what's happened in other jurisdictions where this type of legislation has been put in. It applies to certain types of organizations. So a board of director situation for an organization like the Board of Trade might be exempt, but again, we'd have to wait and see what specific legislation is introduced. And again, it has not been introduced yet, but the concept has definitely got some interest, I think, from the trade union movement, from employee groups, and at a certain level, after what everyone's been through in the last 2 years of the pressures of working from home and just feeling like it never stops, I think within an employee base or just the general population, it could be an attractive idea. So, but the European legislation, for example, only applies to employees below a certain level. So if you're on a board of director level within a private corporation or a senior executive level, the right to disconnect doesn't exist. Just like in employment standards, if you're a manager, the overtime provisions of the Employment Standards Act do not apply to you. So, I mean, where this type of concept exists elsewhere, there are cutoffs. And so it does apply for the junior employees, but not the senior employees. That could apply here, and it may not come, who knows? But it is something that I think we should watch out for.
Another question from the audience is, they're starting to ask people to return to the office at least 3 days a week, but facing resistance. What are some suggestions on how to handle this? They'd like to see employees back in the office over 50% of the time, but they don't want to face retention issues. So what is some advice? Armin, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. My advice would be not to just ask people to come back to the office. Communication is going to be key. Explaining to them why they're required to be back in the office. Is it critical? And if it is, let them know. Because once people have a sense that there is a need for them to be somewhere, they feel obligated to do so. But if they're just going to think that the employer just wants to ask people to come back to the office, absolutely, there's going to be resistance. And like we said earlier during the conversation as well, not two people are going to be the same. So figuring out why there is a resistance. I mean, I have a hard time believing that people just don't want to do something. So learning about that a little bit more, and then reassuring them that we are taking steps to ensure their safety, that we are going to be flexible if they have at-home obligations. We have to remember we are still in a pandemic, and just because the virus may be coming to an end, we have gone through this for two and a half years. People have adopted and adapted to a very different circumstance than they were pre-pandemic. So my recommendation would be ask them why there is a resistance. Is there a way to figure out how to manage that?
And definitely every situation is going to be different. Even though, this session is focused on the office, I think we also have to recognize that we have a very diverse industry base within the city, whether you're in the retail, construction, manufacturing space. Let's talk about manufacturers, because we have the greatest number of manufacturers in British Columbia, right here in Surrey. And Chris, what is your advice on people, the workforce, feeling challenged? They're making these products, maybe they're cabinet manufacturers, and they have to work in close proximity in Workplace 2.0 on the manufacturing floor. What's your advice in terms of COVID protocol?
Yeah, thanks, Anita. I mean, it actually is very similar to what Armin has said. There are what we have recommended all along is to follow the guidance from public health. So as there is the requirement for orders to be in place, then there's a reason for those orders being put in place, and so employers need to ensure that they're following those orders. And I went through the details of what's currently required within the COVID-19 safety plan order, or the workplace health and safety order. So it's important that employers are following that. We had the restaurants and or the food and liquor order that was recently lifted, but that one had certain pieces within it, gathering and events. So depending on the employer and which orders apply to them, those are the requirements that are expected for employers to be able to follow. But beyond that, I kind of want to align my response similar to what Armin was saying. It's about having that communication and conversation with your staff, that if your staff, your workers, have concerns, whether they're in a manufacturing facility or a construction site or any location, if they have concerns about the protocols that you might have in place as the employer, then you should be encouraging those workers to bring those issues forward and have that conversation. Not necessarily saying it needs to go to refusal of unsafe work. I mean, that's kind of another level here, but open up that environment for your workers to have that conversation with you, bring their issues forward, and then work through those issues. And maybe there might be an opportunity to put barriers back up in a short period of time. Or maybe there's an opportunity to stagger shifts, to have fewer people in the office at once as you're sort of slowly coming back into that environment again. There's lots of options that would be viable under the orders that are currently in place. And again, encouraging your workers to bring those concerns forward and have those conversations and involve your joint committee, involve your worker health and safety representatives, can go a long ways in dealing with those issues. And so that's really where it starts, is with that conversation.
And I also want to note that WorkSafeBC also has and was a leader in terms of developing industry-specific COVID safety guidelines as well, and they're on their website, WorkSafeBC. Just another question for you, Chris, is about rapid testing policies. Should businesses implement rapid testing policies?
Yeah, and maybe David can weigh in on that one a little bit as well. It's sort of similar to vaccination policies in a way. If the employer is going to go down the road of having rapid testing policies in place, then what we're saying to employers is they need to do their own due diligence on that and look at privacy policies, HR and labor policies, as well as any safety policies that would fall under that as well. What we're saying to employers, though, is if the employer does decide to go with a rapid testing policy in place, then there is a requirement, and it is outlined in the workplace safety order, that the employer is communicating that to their workers and clearly outlining the procedures for following that policy related to rapid testing. And those procedures are likely going to flow down from the BC CDC guidance on how to utilize the rapid test. So there are protocols. It's not just a matter of saying, yeah, you need to do the rapid test. You actually need to outline that for your workers and ensure that they know how to use the test appropriately, and that's being communicated. But the decision to have a rapid test policy in place, that's not a requirement under the Act and the regulation. and it's really up to the employer to make that decision based on their own due diligence. David, you probably have a lot to say here as well.
We only have 9 minutes left, but the point of whether you're going to implement either a vaccination or rapid testing policy, I think has to be guided by medical advice, but there are also practical considerations, cost, training for people giving the test. Whenever you're doing tests in the workplace like that, you're balancing between, employee privacy issues and, collection of personal fluids and all that sort of stuff. You're introducing that into your workplace. And so you're balancing that against your need for a safe and healthy workplace. And you need to determine if where we are right now is that the right balance? Is it the right time to introduce this type of policy? So, people should not rush into this, and they certainly should be connecting with the regional health authorities. Like, what should we do? I have employers that are outside of the Surrey area, a little bit more remote. It's very difficult for them to get anything back quickly, and they're concerned about reliability of rapid tests. So all of these things, have to be part of an employer's calculus. And the point I was making at the first thing is, you also need to consider, when do we take away these policies? Like, that's also part of the calculus, because they're not going to be there forever. So it is a tricky thing, and don't rush into those things is my suggestion.
With all of these very complicated decisions that need to be made, that seem to change, as we go on this ongoing journey, it would be beneficial for businesses, organizations, if they can, to get the legal, the HR advice. And as a baseline, the safety policies that are provided by WorkSafeBC are absolutely integral to the safety and future of your business and of your organization. Another question from the audience, maybe to David, is would you be able to talk a little bit more about the right to disconnect? When do you think we will see this in the provincial legislation? What kind of requirements will be included?
Okay, well, I have not been elected as an MLA, and I have no insight on when we will see this. And I know the provincial government obviously has a lot on its plate. So it's a policy issue. We are starting to see this discussion in the province of Ontario. And interestingly, the Ontario provincial government, from an ideological perspective, is very different than our provincial government. So, we do have a provincial government that listens to employee concerns and to trade union concerns. And so, if there becomes a greater groundswell for the right to disconnect becoming part of our provincial legislation, that could happen this year. But, I can't give a timeline on that. I also can't give a timeline on what it would contain. But I would expect that there will be a consultation process. There typically is. There has been for changes to WorkSafe. There has been for changes to employment standards. So and where we would probably see this is amendments to the Employment Standards Act. So organizations like the Surrey Board of Trade, who can stand up for their members, really should participate in that process, because it's important that the employer perspective, from my perspective, the employer perspective is articulated and people understand the consequence of this type of legislative amendment. So that's really a long way of saying I can't answer that question.
And my final question, maybe both to David and to Armin, is what if a staff member tests positive? What is the obligation of the employer to tell other staff, or does the employer keep it confidential, respecting their right to privacy? Maybe Armin, do you want to take that first, and then David?
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. To answer that question, we don't have to look far. There are opportunities to visit the public health advices, follow those. As we know now, especially with the Omicron variants, it is no longer as big of an issue as it was in the past. And David's probably a better person to answer that, and Chris probably follow up with the WorkSafeBC. But as of right now, we are not required to inform unless the employee themselves wants to take the step and go out and say, hey, guess what? I got COVID-19. I'm just letting you know. The problem with that, though, is there may be consequences that we may not necessarily take into account as an employer. For example, what if an employee says, "Oh, I just heard that X had tested positive. I don't feel comfortable coming to work for at least for the duration of X, Y, and Z period." So we just got to be very careful with that. I would encourage employees who test positive, instead of making a organization-wide announcement, perhaps talk to the management, or perhaps talk to the HR department and figure out what the best way to communicate that is, and do a risk assessment. Does it really impact anybody within that group that they should be made aware of? Now, one thing that I did want to talk to with respect to what David said regarding the policy for just signing off at the end of the business day, we have to remember, as great as the legislation would be, a company doesn't need to wait for a legislation to bring in that policy. And what a great service to the employees it would be to say, guess what? As part of our perk, for business perk, if you're employed with us, you don't have to worry about answering calls after 5 p.m. and really incorporating that into the business before the legislation comes into effect. I'm going to stop and let David carry on with the conversation. And Chris, thank you.
David.
Yeah, I think Armin's point is, his first point is really important. Like, the novelty of having of a positive test kind of wore off around Christmas time when everybody seemed to get it. Like, and now it's more unusual if you haven't had COVID. So, or at least anecdotally. So I think that the way employers react to a positive test in the workplace has changed in the last 6 months, certainly. And again, the guidance has to come from the public health authority. If there are concerns about close contacts, then those people probably should be advised. But there is a privacy consideration, and you don't need to, as Armin says, you don't need to tell everyone about a positive test. Follow the guidance from the public health authorities. They're not doing contact tracing or anything like that anymore. And just let the person work from home or be at home if they can't work, and follow the proper isolation timeframe. Thanks.
Chris, any final words?
No, I think that was well covered by David and Armin. In fact, David said just that last point, I think, is the important piece, is the BCCC has outlined very specific self-isolation and self-monitoring guidance. And there really isn't a need to communicate to staff, because all of your workers should be following the self-monitoring guidance, and if they have symptoms, shouldn't be coming into the workplace.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your expertise. And remember, have a relaxing weekend, because we're back at it on Monday. And the Surrey Board of Trade is here for you. If you need anything, just let us know.